Under the weight of a late summer sun, the old craftsman-style house stood quietly at the end of Larchwood Lane, its faded blue siding softened by years of weather and silence. It was neither the newest nor the most well-kept home on the street, but to Lena Cooper it was everything. A personal statement. A reclamation of life after years spent balancing other people's needs. Her former husband's, her boss's, her clients', her co-workers'. The house had quirks, like a temperamental back gate that leaned when it rained or the way the floor creaked under the hallway window even when no one was there. But none of that mattered. It was hers. She'd bought it in her own name, with her own savings, and it was the first thing in years that hadn't come with anyone else's fingerprints. Lena worked for the city's land records division, a place with more fluorescent light than natural air and the persistent smell of old paper. Her days were filled with zoning appeals, parcel boundary disputes, and municipal easement surveys. It was work most would find dry, but to her it offered structure, predictability. In a world that so often spun off course, she found a small measure of control in legal maps and regulatory consistency, but at home she embraced quiet disorder. Unplanned planting beds that had turned into thriving basil and lavender bushes, a second-hand fire pit with a slight lean, and wind chimes she hadn't planned to buy but couldn't stop listening to. Her evenings were sacred. Tea, a book, and sometimes just her and the crickets on the porch. She noticed Karen within the first week of moving in. It was hard not to. Karen Elbridge was the type of woman who seemed to announce her presence without saying a word. Early 60s, always dressed like she was about to receive guests at a garden party, and always holding something, a watering can, a clipboard, or most commonly, a phone pressed to her ear like a lifeline. Karen lived in the house diagonally across the street, where the hedges were cut with militaristic precision, the mailbox was polished, and the lawn had clearly been measured. Karen was polite in the way people are when politeness is their weapon. Her compliments always came with a tonal tilt, a laced message. "What a charming little place you've got," she said the day they met, eyes scanning Lena's garden like it had offended her. Rustic. Very. Natural, Lena had smiled, nodded, and moved on. The two had minimal contact at first, which suited Lena perfectly. She was cordial when they crossed paths and made mental notes to keep her music at a low volume. The street had a kind of rhythm to it, one Lena respected. People waved but didn't linger, spoke but didn't pry. It was a neighborhood where everyone seemed to know everyone, and that knowledge was currency. Lena wasn't trying to buy in. It started with the hose. The outdoor spigot on the side of Lena's house was old, cast iron and slightly angled but functional. She used it for watering her plants or rinsing off muddy boots. One morning she noticed the hose uncoiled. Not just uncoiled, but stretched across the narrow strip of gravel between her home and the fence. An awkward distance to be left that way unless used recently. She chalked it up to forgetfulness. A week passed, and again it was uncoiled. This time she knew she hadn't touched it. And the odd thing was the water. She was certain she'd turned it off, yet the nozzle was damp and there was a faint trail of runoff near the garden. She didn't want to assume. Maybe a contractor passing through, maybe some kid messing around. But there was no construction nearby, no neighborhood children known to wander, and the motion sensor light had clicked on twice at night with no visible explanation. When Lena mentioned the water usage to her utility provider, the representative told her usage had doubled since last month. It wasn't until a Saturday morning 2 weeks later that she caught Karen walking across the narrow back path with a large plastic watering jug in hand, the hose in the other. Lena was inside, just off the kitchen, sipping coffee and enjoying a rare moment of laziness. She watched in stunned silence as Karen, not in a rush, not sneaking, connected the hose, turned the valve, filled her jug, and calmly walked away. It was so brazen, it almost seemed unreal. Lena didn't confront her. Not yet. Not directly. Confrontation wasn't her style unless she had facts, context, and certainty. That evening, she walked the perimeter of her property, checking the fence line and spigot. There were muddy footprints near the gate, a subtle path where the dirt had been lightly compressed into a trail. She went to bed with the uncomfortable feeling of having been watched, or worse, trespassed. The following week brought small, strange developments. A box of delivery packages meant for her was found at the neighbor's house. A garden tool she'd left on her back porch was suddenly missing, and 2 days later appeared back in its place, but cleaned. One of her solar path lights had been repositioned. Each event was minor on its own, easy to dismiss, but together they suggested something else entirely, a pattern of small intrusions. Passive, almost gentle in execution, but steady, intentional. Lena took a walk around the neighborhood to see what others did. Some had motion lights. One neighbor, Mr. Sinclair down the road, had a chain lock on his front hose spigot. She asked him about it over casual conversation. "You'd be surprised what people feel entitled to when they think you're not watching," he said with a knowing look. Water, tools, even fruit from your own damn trees. Still, Lena hesitated to escalate. She'd grown up being taught not to stir problems that could be handled quietly. That being right didn't mean you had to be loud. But the next time she passed Karen, the older woman gave her a bright smile and said, "I do hope you don't mind. Just a little water here and there. The city has those restrictions now, and my boys planted those azaleas. They need all the help they can get. You understand?" It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It was a declaration layered in casual entitlement, and Lena realized with cold clarity, Karen didn't think she was doing anything wrong. In fact, she likely thought Lena should be grateful to have her property used in such a friendly, neighborly way. Lena's silence had become permission. Her politeness was now a license. The thing about people like Karen, Lena thought, is that they count on you not wanting to make a scene. They rely on discomfort, on social reluctance, on your desire to avoid looking like the problem. And by the time you say no, they've already taken yes for an answer, weeks ago. That night, Lena didn't sleep well. It wasn't the sound of anything unusual. It was the knowledge that someone had crossed a line and believed it didn't matter, and that if she didn't act now, the next line would be harder to defend. By morning, she'd made a decision, not out of revenge, not even anger, but self-protection. She researched water backflow valves, hose locks, and anti-siphon systems. She found an old contractors forum that described a practical but rarely used method for deterring unauthorized access to outdoor water sources: pressurized dye. Non-toxic, long-lasting, visually distinct. A method developed for identifying illegal irrigation tapping in dry, rural zones. Lena bookmarked the page. She was tired of playing defense. The next week passed in tense quiet. The kind of stillness that isn't peace, but rather the breath held before something finally breaks. Lena had taken steps, though not the ones most people would notice. She hadn't shouted, hadn't left passive-aggressive notes, hadn't posted in community forums or tried to rally sympathy. She didn't want attention. She wanted boundaries, real ones. The hose had been replaced with a reinforced model that locked at the nozzle and connected to a pressure valve she'd custom-installed herself after a few late nights spent on plumbing forums and talking with an equipment supplier she knew from work. The valve had a hidden compartment containing a cartridge filled with a fluorescent blue dye, non-toxic, water-soluble, and nearly impossible to wash off skin or fabric for at least 24 hours. It wasn't meant to cause harm. It was meant to leave a mark, a very visible, undeniable, and inconvenient one. By the time she finished the setup, it was nearly midnight. She tested it once, then locked the system and went inside. She felt no guilt. She had thought long and hard about it, especially about the moral implications. But when someone treats your property as an extension of their convenience and continues to do so even after being given polite resistance, the time for soft diplomacy ends. This wasn't a war. But it was certainly a campaign now, one that required clear lines and consequences. It happened 2 days later. Lena was home in the late morning, organizing old utility files in her sunroom, when she heard a short, confused yell from the side of the house. It wasn't loud. It had that muffled, startled quality people make when they're trying not to draw attention. She set her papers down and stepped to the window, heart steady. She didn't need to look. She knew. A few seconds later, the sound of retreating footsteps. Then silence. She didn't go outside, not right away. She made herself wait, count to 300 slowly, hands in her pockets. When she finally stepped out, the hose was once again uncoiled and slightly twisted. The nozzle dripped a faint line of blue onto the dirt. A single wet footprint, smudged with dye, led away from the spigot toward the back gate. That evening, as she watered her own plants, carefully, deliberately, with a different can from her storage, she spotted something strange across the street. Karen's front door was cracked open, but the curtains were drawn, and a pair of sneakers, blue-streaked and set in the sun, rested on the porch like an offering to no one. Lena didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just returned to her business and felt something settle. A correction, perhaps. Not a win, but an answer. It didn't take long for the retaliation to begin. The next morning, Lena found a paper flyer wedged under her mailbox flag, a typed letter with a fake neighborhood header she'd never seen before, claiming her recent actions had been disruptive, hostile, and unnecessary, and that certain unnamed neighbors had expressed concern. It wasn't signed. The formatting was sloppy. No official channel, no contact listed, a scare tactic. She read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a manila folder she had labeled simply, Incidents. That same evening, someone moved one of her garden markers. A minor act, almost laughable. But it had been pulled out and placed face down behind her compost bin, a space she rarely checked. Had she not been reorganizing that very afternoon, she might never have noticed. It felt like someone whispering just behind her ear. Not threatening, not dramatic, but persistent. There was a kind of cowardice in these small acts, but cowardice doesn't make them harmless. It makes them insidious. Lena filed a police report, not an emergency call, not a confrontation. She went to the local station with her folder, explained the situation clearly, calmly, and asked to make a formal log in the system. The officer she spoke with didn't roll his eyes or try to wave her off. He simply nodded, took notes, and suggested installing security lighting. She had already done so. Still, it was recorded. Now it existed somewhere outside her own mind. 2 days later, the dye incident reached its inevitable echo. Lena was in her front yard, tending to a wilting azalea near the driveway when she heard a car door shut with sharp finality. She turned her head slowly, rising from a crouch, and saw Karen standing on the sidewalk in a crisp blouse and oversized sunglasses. Her tone was even, but her body buzzed with restrained indignation. "I know what you did," she said, skipping all pretense of small talk. Lena wiped her hands on a towel clipped to her belt, met her gaze without flinching. "You trespassed," she replied, voice steady. Karen ignored the word. "This neighborhood doesn't appreciate that kind of behavior. It's antisocial. People talk." Lena raised a brow. Then they should stop walking onto property that doesn't belong to them. The moment hung between them like a wire pulled taut. Karen didn't step closer. She looked at the hose, looked at Lena, then turned and walked away. Lena felt the breath in her chest finally release once Karen disappeared into her house. She didn't enjoy it. She wasn't a confrontational person by nature, but what she had discovered was that assertiveness felt different from aggression. It wasn't a demand. It was a refusal. a refusal to be managed, to be shaped, to be erased in her own space. But retaliation has a way of shifting forms. That weekend, a city notice appeared on Lena's door. A complaint had been submitted against her for suspected hazardous garden chemicals and unregistered water modification. The phrasing was awkward, but the implications were serious. The notice cited a vague ordinance and gave a deadline to respond. Lena read the fine print, then sat down and began preparing her documents. Purchase receipts for the dye solution, EPA safety certification, water bills, photos of her setup, and a notarized letter she requested from her equipment supplier verifying that the installation posed no risk. She included the original flyer she'd received anonymously too, just in case. She wasn't angry. She was precise. She dropped the packet at the municipal building herself the next morning. It wasn't about winning. It was about not being cornered. The next few days passed with an eerie calm. Karen didn't appear. The hose stayed untouched, but Lena noticed other signs. A car parked too long across the street. A slow drive-by where the passenger stared a few seconds too long. The feeling of being observed had returned, and now it wore a different shape. Less invasive, more strategic, as though someone was gathering data rather than acting out. Then, on Tuesday evening, her garden was clipped, not vandalized, not destroyed, just altered. 3 of her flowering stems, carefully tied to grow up along the trellis, had been cut cleanly at the base. No mess, no torn leaves, just snipped, removed, not by an animal, not by wind. It was surgical. A message. Lena stood in the dark, looking at the clean edges where her hard work had been undone, and she felt that particular mix of grief and fury that only comes when someone defiles something made with care. She took no immediate action. She went inside, poured herself a glass of water, sat at the table, and opened a new document. A timeline. She titled it simply, Encroachments. She listed everything. Dates, incidents, observations. It was methodical. She attached photos. She included times. Not for revenge. Not even for the police. For herself. To see the shape of what was happening. To name it. And by naming it, not let it take root in silence. She wasn't preparing for war. She was refusing to lose another inch. And though the spigot sat silent that night, still locked and untampered, Lena understood something deeply. People like Karen didn't always storm gates. Sometimes they came through the cracks, slowly, subtly, until you forgot what the fence was for in the first place. But Lena remembered. And this time, she wasn't letting it happen. The days that followed carried the brittle quiet of a house that had begun to hold its breath. Lena moved through them with the caution of someone who had started to feel a shift in the air, something subtle but distinct, like a drop in pressure before a storm. There was no obvious confrontation, no direct incident. Karen hadn't reappeared, but that was part of what made it worse. The silence was too deliberate, too measured, like a play paused just before the line that changes the entire scene. The city had closed the complaint regarding the dye device. Lena received an official notice in the mail. No code violation detected. Case closed. It was what she expected. She had supplied more than enough documentation. But even with that outcome, she sensed that she hadn't heard the last of it. With people like Karen, retreat didn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it just meant reloading. The first real escalation came on a Wednesday morning. Lena had stepped out just before dawn to check her tomato plants, which had begun to show signs of late summer strain. As she rounded the side of the house, she noticed something that stopped her mid-step. The side gate, usually shut with a click lock, stood slightly ajar. That alone could have been wind. But then she saw the scratch marks around the lock. Fresh, shallow gouges in the wood, too deliberate to be weather. She examined the gate more closely. The latch had been forced, not broken, but bent, as though someone had tried to push through it without tools and then gave up. Or worse, succeeded, and then reset it to make it appear untouched. Inside the yard, everything looked normal at first glance, but Lena noticed that the small ceramic frog near the base of her garden spigot was gone. It wasn't valuable, just a decorative piece she'd had since college, but she always placed it in the same spot like a tiny, harmless marker of domestic life. Now it was gone. Displaced. She checked the ground, found no signs of it having broken or fallen. It had been taken. She stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where it had been, and felt a strange kind of disorientation, like looking at a photograph with one important figure erased. Later that afternoon, she went to the hardware store and bought a new lock for the gate, this time with a motion-triggered alarm that gave off a short but sharp warning tone when disturbed, not loud enough to draw the entire street's attention, just enough to alert her. Enough to say, "I see you." That night, the alarm chirped once at 2:17 a.m. Lena was already awake. She didn't go outside. She turned on the porch light and waited by the window for 15 minutes. Nothing moved. The gate was closed when she checked it in the morning. But the grass near the side path had a single partial boot print, pressed into the dewy ground. She measured it silently with her eye. A man's size, likely. Broader than Karen's. Worn soles. It hadn't rained, so the footprint wouldn't last long. She took a photo anyway. The next evening, she received a knock at the door. Not loud, not rushed. Calculated. She opened it and found a man standing just off the porch step. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, khakis, and a tucked-in polo, holding a clipboard. He didn't introduce himself by name. He said he was helping out around the neighborhood, which was not a job description, and then began asking vague questions about water use, exterior modifications, and whether Lena had properly updated her yard fixture permits. Lena didn't answer. Right away. She didn't have to. She asked for his ID. He hesitated. She asked again, this time with a sharper tone. He shifted, uncomfortable now, and said something about neighborhood committee authority and community standards. Lena told him flatly that her property was not under any regulatory group other than the city, and that if he returned without official identification or a warrant, she would consider it trespassing. She stepped back and closed the door. His voice rose once, calling after her. It doesn't have to be difficult, you know. But she didn't reopen it. She watched from the side window as he walked back toward Karen's house. He didn't knock on her door. He simply turned down the side of her yard and disappeared into the backyard. Not a repairman, not a code officer. Someone playing at legitimacy, trying to rattle her into giving ground. And, maybe worse, someone operating with Karen's knowledge, or her invitation. That night, Lena reported the interaction to the police. Again, no emergency. Just another entry in the file. She requested a copy of the report and wrote down everything she remembered. Height, build, accent, the clipboard, the odd phrasing. She added it to her timeline document. Her file was getting thicker. Days passed with more fragments than incidents, but each fragment had a weight that accumulated. A section of her fencing panel was loosened. Not removed, not broken, just nudged from its anchor points. Her compost bin had been shifted 3 feet to the left, and one morning, she found her water meter lid propped open, the metal plate lifted and not fully returned. That, more than anything, chilled her. Someone was trying to understand the infrastructure of her property. On the following Sunday, she left for the store and returned 90 minutes later to find the gate wide open, one of her tomato plants slashed clean through at the stem, and a single gardening glove, not hers, resting on top of her compost heap. No footprints, no note, no obvious damage to the house, but the message was clear. We can get in any time. She sat down that evening and typed up a certified letter to the local community office. Not an accusation, just a formal notice documenting the pattern of events, the uninvited visitors, the property interference. She included images, a written timeline, and a quiet but firm request for acknowledgement. Not resolution, not even action, just record-keeping, something official to match the silent war being waged around her. She sent a copy to her lawyer, not because she intended to sue, but because she understood the value of establishing context early. Karen remained publicly invisible. But on Monday morning, Lena found a yellow sticky note placed face down on her mailbox lid. Written in sharp penmanship, it read, "Escalation isn't wise. Think before you act." No signature, no hint of origin. But the note's deliberate placement said more than the words themselves. Lena added it to the folder. She began driving a different route to and from work, not because she feared being followed, but because she wanted to vary her presence. She installed a second lockbox on the outdoor spigot and added a motion-activated camera disguised as a sprinkler head. She bought a second compost bin and filled it with garbage, non-rotting, but visually unpleasant. A decoy, a trap, and then she waited. 3 nights later, at 3:11 a.m., the motion camera pinged her phone. She watched from bed as a figure crouched near the spigot. They wore gloves, dark clothes. They touched the handle, paused, then turned and looked toward the compost bin. The video had no audio, but the figure stepped back slowly, unsure now. They moved toward the back gate, then froze again, apparently startled by something out of frame. Then they disappeared. She reviewed the footage 3 times. It was grainy but clear enough to see the posture, hesitation, confusion. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just confirmation. She hadn't imagined any of this. By morning, the tomato plant had been dug up entirely, roots exposed and tossed to the side like garbage. A crude insult, but Lena didn't touch it. She took photographs, measured the hole, checked for footprints, found none. That evening she didn't water the garden. She didn't walk the yard. She made dinner, read a chapter of a mystery novel, and went to bed early. There are lines that don't get crossed in one step. They are edged over in inches, disguised as favors, excuses, misunderstandings. And once crossed, they are hard to draw again. But Lena had drawn hers, boldly, in permanent ink. And though it was clear someone intended to smear or erase it, she would redraw it again, and again, and again, as many times as it took. By the 3rd week, Lena had grown accustomed to subtle tension wrapping itself around every daily task like a second skin. Her routines were the same: coffee at 6, leave for work by 8, home before 5, but her attention had sharpened. She noticed things she once wouldn't have bothered to register. A car parked slightly out of line, the sound of a gate hinge too familiar to be random, the pause in neighborhood chatter when she stepped outside. None of it was dramatic, none of it overt, and yet each passing day it became more obvious that her presence, or rather her refusal to be manipulated, had disrupted something carefully curated by others. She had thought it would fade. That after the initial embarrassment of the dye trap, Karen would step back and move on to another target, perhaps someone less precise, less prepared to push back. But the absence of direct confrontation proved more disquieting than a screaming match might have been. It became clear that this wasn't about a hose or a garden or neighborhood etiquette. It was about control, quiet, creeping, and cultivated over time by someone who had long operated unchecked. The city official Lena had written to responded at last. The reply was formal and measured, thanking her for the documentation and stating that, while your concerns fall outside the scope of city enforcement, her report had been acknowledged and filed. It was bureaucracy at its most polished, and she hadn't expected more, But the phrase, outside the scope, clung to her thoughts for the rest of the day. It meant, you're alone in this. It meant, this battle is yours. On her lunch break, she did something she hadn't done before. She drove to the local property registrar's office, not for work, but for herself. She looked up the records for Karen's property, reviewed the access easements, setback lines, shared drainage allowances. Nothing surprising came up. But as she scanned the metadata of each document, she noticed that nearly all of them had been reviewed and updated not by the city in recent years, but by a private notary with a familiar last name. Elbridge, Karen's late husband. A minor civic figure from years ago, whose name still lingered in records no one bothered to question. It didn't mean anything directly, not legally. But it hinted at history, at someone who had spent decades embedding themselves into the hidden framework of the neighborhood. Influence not exerted through title or rank, but through presence, through the quiet reputation that gives someone a pass when they step out of line, because everyone believes they built the line in the first place. Lena closed the binder and thanked the clerk. She left the office feeling something she hadn't expected. Not fear, not anxiety, but clarity. Karen had been allowed to operate this way for years, possibly decades, and Lena had been the first disruption to that balance. The first resident not to absorb the intrusion with a smile and a nod. It wasn't just about a hose. It was about a system, informal but powerful, that had always rewarded submission and punished resistance with whispers, letters, glances, and quiet acts of sabotage. That evening, when she returned home, the second compost bin, the decoy she'd filled with garbage, had been emptied. Not removed, not broken. Just neatly cleaned out and left with the lid propped open, as if to say, I know your games, too. Lena didn't react. She didn't make a show of checking cameras or calling anyone. Instead, she brought out a third bin, left it beside the others, and returned inside. If they wanted to test her endurance, she would outlast them. But endurance alone wouldn't be enough. That night she sat at her kitchen table and reviewed everything again. The timeline, the photos, the reports. There was a shape to it now, a rhythm she could trace. Not just retaliation, but escalation and calculation. Whoever was involved was watching her patterns and responding to her moves, not with panic, but with method. She realized she needed to break that rhythm. The next day, Lena didn't go straight home after work. Instead, she visited a co-worker, Michael, someone she didn't know well but trusted enough to share a cup of coffee with and talk loosely about weird neighbor dynamics. She left out names, kept details vague, but it was enough to trigger recognition. Michael told her about a distant cousin of his who had dealt with a similar situation. Boundary harassment, garden tampering, escalating property interference. The cousin had filed a claim for private nuisance, not through the police, but via civil code, using pattern documentation and property value assessments as leverage. Lena asked questions, took mental notes, didn't overplay her interest. She didn't want a lawsuit. She didn't want drama. But knowing there was a separate route, one outside the useless city channels, mattered. Knowledge, once again, was armor. When she got home that evening, her gate was shut. Lights were normal, but someone had left a bag of seed mix on her front step with a note, "For the bare patch near your fence." Consider it a peace gesture. No name, no handwriting she recognized, but the seed bag had a torn corner. Just enough for the mix to leak slightly and leave a faint trail. She followed it down the porch stairs, across the walkway, and stopped when she saw it led directly toward the Elbridge property line. It wasn't a gift. It was bait, a test, an invitation to let down her guard. She didn't throw the seed away. She didn't touch it either. She left it exactly where it was and made a photo log. Then she emailed it to her lawyer and went to bed early. That night, it rained. Hard. For the first time in weeks. Lena stood by the window, watching as the downpour erased all the small signs left in the dirt and grass. The footprints, the trails, the crumbs of evidence. It was a clean slate, and that somehow made the threat feel deeper. A mind like Karen's didn't stop in the rain. It only moved indoors. The next morning, Lena found a laminated flyer stuck into her yard with a stake. Friendly reminder. Neglecting property maintenance affects everyone's curb appeal. It was mass-produced but local in design, using a familiar community layout. Template. No return address. She removed it quietly, folded it, and dropped it into the incident folder. She took no immediate counteraction. Instead, she started going outside at irregular hours, 10 in the morning one day, 4 in the afternoon the next. She trimmed hedges that didn't need trimming, swept already clean walkways, raked the same corner of mulch twice. She wasn't being watched now. She was watching back. The neighborhood had eyes, and now they knew she had hers open too. It was during one of those afternoon walks that she saw a stranger speaking to Karen on the back patio. A man in his 50s, athletic posture, speaking low and leaning in. Not a relative, not a neighbor. Too comfortable to be hired help, too quiet to be official. They didn't notice Lena watching. She made no move to call attention to herself, but she noted the detail. Black pickup truck parked 2 blocks away, facing the wrong direction on the street. That evening, she checked her cameras. There were no obvious intrusions, no attempts on the Spigot, but one camera, installed near the side of the house, had a single frame corrupted. Just one. A blink of static at 2:46 a.m. The rest of the footage intact, clean, unaltered, but that 1 second, gone. She saved it separately, labeled it, dated it. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. The fight had changed, and so had she. Under the surface of calm suburban repetition, Lena began to feel the pressure of something larger taking shape. If the earlier intrusions had felt like jabs, a test of her limits, attempts to push her into retreat, this new stage of tension carried the weight of something coordinated, calculated, and worse, emboldened. It was no longer about a garden hose or a misplaced garden ornament. This was a campaign, strategic and silent, and each day that passed without a direct confrontation made it more insidious. It began with the mail. Subtle, small changes. 2 days of no deliveries, followed by a sudden influx of envelopes with misprinted names. Her water bill arrived opened, torn in a way that suggested it had been resealed poorly. She contacted the post office and was told that no one had reported tampering. She requested a formal mail hold for the week and had the items rerouted to a P.O. box she'd set up during her divorce years ago, but had not used in some time. That night she found a small, clean cut near the rubber seal of her mailbox door, too exact to be weather-related. She didn't repair it. She photographed it and moved on. The next escalation came not at her home, but through whispers. A colleague she barely interacted with mentioned hearing something odd about Lena from someone's relative. Something about ongoing issues, compliance, and possible fines. The details were vague, second-hand, and seemingly innocent. But Lena knew gossip's design. She recognized the pattern, the slow erosion of credibility through implication rather than accusation. She didn't confront the colleague. She simply returned to her desk and added a note to her timeline. Then came the trash. On a Monday morning, she wheeled her bin out to the curb, same as always. But by afternoon, it had been moved. Not tipped over, not damaged, moved. It now stood across the street, placed carefully in front of an empty lot, as though it had been set out by someone else entirely. Inside were papers Lena didn't recognize. Torn sections of catalogs, junk mail, even a wrapper from a fast food chain she'd never visited. But at the very bottom, under the liner, she found the garden frog ornament that had gone missing weeks earlier. Covered in dirt, one eye cracked and wrapped in a grocery store bag that hadn't come from her home. She didn't remove it. She brought the entire bin inside her fence and left it there untouched. If someone was watching, they'd see that she had seen. That was enough for now. The camera system, once a quiet comfort, began to malfunction in strange ways. Not frequent, not loud, just subtle shifts. The angle of one cam was altered by a few degrees. A motion alert triggered with no footage recorded. Another night, the power to the front porch camera cut out entirely for exactly 8 minutes, then resumed as if nothing had happened. Lena checked the wiring, found no sign of sabotage. She contacted the manufacturer, who suggested power surges, but her breaker panel showed no such anomalies. She replaced one of the cams with a hardwired backup, the kind with internal storage, just in case. It was the next morning when she found the dead patch of grass. A clean rectangle precisely 2 feet by 4 centered directly in front of her side gate. No scorch marks, no chemicals visible to the eye, just decay. Brown and brittle, framed perfectly by still green lawn. As if someone had laid something heavy there for hours, then removed it without leaving a trace of the object itself. She measured it, documented it, and then began researching signal jamming devices, weighing the possibility that some kind of hardware had been used to interfere with her cameras. Later that week, the note came. It wasn't on her property this time. It was inside her office cubicle, tucked neatly between files on her desk in a plain envelope with no markings. The message was typed. Simple. Chilling. You're making this harder than it has to be. People who fight back usually lose more than they realize. No threats, no names, just implication and boldness. She didn't tell her supervisor. She didn't report it to office security. She made a copy, uploaded an encrypted version to her cloud backup, and placed the original in her safe at home. She changed her office routine after that. New routes to the bathroom, new parking space, new lunch schedule. That Friday, someone rang her doorbell at 3:14 a.m. She woke instantly, body tense. She watched through the peephole. A figure in a hoodie stood with head down, hands in pockets. They didn't move, didn't knock again, just stood there. After 30 seconds, they walked away. Her porch light flicked off a moment later, though it was on a timer. She stayed up until dawn, sitting at her kitchen table, every muscle wired. When the sun rose, she opened the door to find a flyer taped to her mailbox once again. This time it read, "Be mindful of escalating behaviors. Isolation is dangerous." Lena didn't wait for the next move. That weekend, she attended a self-defense seminar at a nearby gym, the kind designed for civilians who didn't want to own weapons but knew how to handle a confrontation. She kept her presence low-key, didn't introduce herself, and never mentioned why she was there. But every moment was useful. She learned how to break holds, identify tailing cars, and how to safely de-escalate a situation without retreating. The instructor had said something that stuck with her. Control isn't about winning. It's about removing their ability to predict your next step. That night, Lena parked her car in a different spot down the block and walked home in silence. Every light in the house stayed off until after 10 p.m. The retaliation shifted again. Karen's house remained quiet. No interactions, no visible presence, and yet Lena knew better than to assume distance meant disengagement. One morning, she discovered her water main had been partially closed, just enough to reduce pressure, not cut it. She called the city. A tech arrived, examined the system, and said casually, "Looks like someone opened the valve box. You didn't mention a repair request, right?" Lena said nothing. She watched as he resealed the box and marked the check as completed. That evening, she installed a tamper sensor. 2 days later, she saw someone walking her perimeter. A teenage girl, maybe 17, holding a clipboard and wearing a shirt with a tree logo, ostensibly from an environmental group, conducting surveys. She asked Lena if she had a minute to talk about water use and neighbor cooperation. Lena declined politely, and when the girl hesitated, asking a second time, Lena responded more firmly and watched as the girl's smile faltered, replaced by the blank neutrality of someone repeating a job they didn't understand. She left. But as Lena watched her walk away, she saw her pause at Karen's mailbox, pretend to check something, then continue down the road. Another test. Another proxy. The next morning, the blue dye trap had been triggered again. This time it was sprayed not on a person, but across the side of Lena's shed. A vertical line of fluorescent streaks, suggesting someone had tried to tamper with the mechanism and failed. They hadn't reached the release valve, but they'd gotten close. Too close. She scrubbed it off herself. Not because it bothered her, but because it no longer needed to be seen. She wasn't signaling to anyone anymore. She was preparing. That afternoon, she updated her will. Not out of paranoia, out of clarity. She set up a durable power of attorney, confirmed her property rights, and left written instructions for her sister, who lived 3 states away, detailing every step to take in the event Lena became incapacitated or disappeared. The document wasn't dramatic. It was precise, tightly worded, legally sound. She mailed a copy to her sister and didn't explain it beyond. Just a precaution. Things here have gotten strange. The fear, when it came now, didn't feel like panic. It felt like an old, familiar shadow at her back. A presence she acknowledged but no longer let dictate her steps. The true escalation occurred the following week. A break-in attempt. Not successful, but real. The back window to her laundry room showed signs of forced tampering. Scrape marks. A slight crack at the bottom of the pane. She hadn't heard anything. The cameras didn't catch a clear image, only a blur, a flash of motion, and then nothing. But the evidence was physical. She called the police. This time they came quickly, took photos, filed a full report, asked if she suspected anyone. She didn't answer directly. Just handed them her file, thick and organized. Every date, every incident, every piece of paper. The officer read in silence for a few minutes, looked up and said, "You've done everything right. Most people don't document like this. Whoever's behind this, they've been watching." Lena nodded. That was the one thing she had always known. By the end of the week, she had reinforced the windows, changed her locks, updated the exterior lighting, and installed an emergency battery system for her cameras. She took all copies of her documentation, encrypted them, and mailed USB backups to 3 locations. One to her lawyer, one to her sister, and one to a safety deposit box under a different name. The movements were quiet, disciplined, unannounced. And by the time she was done, her house didn't feel like a trap anymore. It felt like a fortress. Not a place to hide, but a place that would not be taken easily. She stopped flinching at every creak. She stopped waiting for someone else to draw the line. Now, the only thing left was to make sure they understood it had already been drawn, and that she would no longer move. It happened on a night so still it felt rehearsed, as if the neighborhood itself had been cued into silence. No wind, no dogs barking. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed to fade into the background. Lena had been reading, though not really following the words on the page. Her senses were tuned elsewhere, to every creak in the walls, every mechanical shift in her heating system, every subtle vibration of the windows. A part of her had known the moment was coming. The movements over the past week had felt too restrained, too patient, as if whoever had been circling her was waiting for her to become complacent. She hadn't. At 2:03 a.m., the first alarm triggered, the side gate, the one with the contact sensor. Lena sat up instantly, heart pounding not with panic, but purpose. She moved quietly to the wall panel and confirmed the breach. The signal was clean. Someone had opened the gate. No hesitation, no attempt at subtlety. This was not another test or warning. This was commitment. She activated the silent response protocol she had installed just days earlier. a private alert to the security company with whom she'd finally signed a contract after the break-in attempt. It wasn't monitored 24 hours by humans, but it triggered a live recording feed and sent a duplicate video directly to her phone and cloud. She moved through the house with practice steps, collecting her phone, flashlight, and a reinforced tactical baton she kept now in a drawer near the pantry. She did not intend to confront anyone. Her plan, now and always, was containment and survival. But as she reached the front window and peeked through the curtain, she froze. A figure stood just inside her yard, beneath the overhang of her porch, not moving, not attempting to hide. It was a man. Tall, heavy-set, wearing dark clothes and a hoodie pulled up to obscure his profile. He stood in the rain that had begun moments earlier, light but steady, his shoulders hunched slightly forward. She couldn't see his hands. He wasn't looking around. He was staring directly at her front door, not moving, not trying to break in, just standing, as though daring her to act. Her camera caught him from 2 angles. She watched the live feed with detached calm, her breathing shallow but even. She opened the police contact shortcut on her phone but didn't press it yet. She wanted documentation first. The man didn't move for 30 seconds. Then he did something that made the hair on her arms rise. He turned slightly and placed something gently onto the welcome mat. Then he stepped backward, slowly, and turned away, walking calmly back down the steps and out through the side gate as if he had just delivered a late-night package. The police arrived 12 minutes later. Lena had already shut off her alarms, disarmed the system, and recorded the man's exit route. The object on the mat was a single rubber glove, cut through the palm, filled with red garden mulch. Inside it, folded into a plastic sandwich bag, was a note typed on the same cheap paper as before. "This is your final opportunity to let it go. You have what you wanted. Now leave it alone." The officers didn't find the man. He had vanished before they arrived, but they took the note, photographed the glove, and reviewed Lena's footage. The lead officer, a younger man who had responded once before, stood on her porch with a furrowed brow and a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there the last time. "They're watching you, and they're bold. That's escalation. If they're leaving messages, they're not afraid of being seen." Lena asked quietly, "So, what now?" The officer hesitated, then said, "Now we take it seriously. I'll file for a protective watch and mark your address for increased patrols. But this feels like it's personal." Lena didn't respond. She didn't have to. She had known that from the beginning. The following morning, she printed every still frame from the video. She arranged them on her kitchen table, studying the posture, the shoes, the angle of the shoulders. There was no clear image of the man's face, but there were other details. His walk, the way he turned his foot when stepping down, the glint of a ring on his right hand, barely visible. She didn't know who he was, not exactly, but she had seen someone like him standing in Karen's yard once before, months earlier, speaking in hushed tones near her back shed. She retrieved that footage, too. It wasn't identical, but it was close enough to fuel the next step. She contacted her lawyer, the same one she had quietly looped in during the earlier phases. She asked him to draft a cease and desist letter, not addressed to Karen directly, but rather to an unnamed resident of the block, regarding persistent, unauthorized entry onto private property, harassment, and veiled threats with potential intent to intimidate. It was a strategic move, not legal warfare. She wanted them to know that the line had been crossed, that there was no more room for games. The letter was delivered to every house within 3 properties of hers, including Karen's. Each envelope was sealed and marked "Legal Notice, Confidential," making it impossible to ignore without opening. Lena didn't watch the delivery. She didn't need to see Karen's face. She knew the impact the letter would have. That same evening, a small group of neighbors gathered across the street. 3 men, 1 woman, standing close, speaking quietly, glancing over occasionally toward Lena's house. One of them made a dismissive gesture. Another shook his head. Karen didn't come outside, but her porch light stayed on until dawn. Then came the retaliation she expected least. On the 3rd day after the letter drop, her power cut out. Not just a flicker, not a storm-induced outage, a full shutdown. The circuit breaker had been tripped, but when she went outside to inspect the box, she found it open. The lock she had placed on it had been pried off and left hanging nearby. Nothing else was damaged, nothing stolen, just the power disabled. Quietly, precisely. She resecured it and filed a report. The officer who came this time was new, younger, polite but clearly uncertain about the depth of her file. She showed him the photos, the letter, the footage, everything. He asked, "Do you think your neighbor is behind this?" Lena said, "I think someone close to her is." And she knows. The officer didn't press. He took her statement, documented the box tampering, and left. That night, Lena didn't sleep. She didn't try. Instead, she sat in her sunroom, surrounded by her files, her digital backups, and a thermos of coffee that she kept refilling without tasting. She replayed the footage again and again. Not to obsess, to prepare. By sunrise, she had made her decision. She was done waiting. She emailed every piece of her documentation to an investigative journalist she had met 3 years earlier through her work on a city planning project. The journalist had covered zoning corruption cases, unlawful surveillance by private citizens, and a piece once about small-town power structures hidden behind neighborly facades. Lena didn't write a full account. She didn't frame it as a tip. She simply sent the files, attached a short note that read, "You'll know what to do with this. I'm not speaking, yet." Then she waited. 2 days passed. No response. On the 3rd day, a reply came. "Got it. I'll dig. Sit tight. And lock your gate." She smiled at that. It was a small thing, but it meant she wasn't completely alone anymore. But the real shift came that evening. As Lena stepped out to check her new camera alignment, she heard a shout from across the street, sudden, sharp. She turned in time to see Karen standing on her porch pointing and yelling at someone just out of frame. Her voice cracked with fury, the words incomprehensible, but filled with venom. Moments later, a man stormed past the curb, tall, broad, angry. Lena recognized the posture instantly. The same from the video. She stepped back into the shadows of her porch, recording with her phone now not for evidence, but instinct. Karen's voice reached her ears as the man turned to snap back. "I told you I don't want heat. You said she was weak." And then they were both gone. Doors slammed. Lights out. Lena stood in the quiet, watching the empty street, her breath steady. She didn't have to win. She only had to hold. And they had just shown their first fracture. That was enough for now. The neighborhood didn't return to normal. It recalibrated. That was the difference Lena noticed most in the days that followed. People didn't smile the same way. Walks were shorter, glances quicker. The conversations that once drifted over fences now faded into closed doors and drawn curtains. Even the sounds of lawnmowers and dogs and idle weekend chatter seemed dampened, as if the street itself had taken a collective breath and decided to hold it. But Lena didn't miss the warmth. She hadn't moved there for community. She had moved there for peace. And what she learned through all of it was that peace wasn't given. It was earned and protected, and, at times, fought for in ways no one prepared you for. The man didn't return. At least not in any visible way. Whether it was the letter, the cameras, the police reports, or the journalist now circling the story like a hawk overhead, Lena couldn't say. Maybe it was the crack in Karen's facade, her loss of control, her loss of trust. Whatever it was, the visits stopped. The spigot remained untouched. The garden remained intact. The garbage bins stayed where she left them. And the motion sensors, though they still triggered occasionally, showed only raccoons or drifting leaves. Karen, for her part, retreated. Her front yard, once clipped and curated like a magazine spread, began to show small signs of neglect. Hedges uneven, porch light flickering, newspapers left too long on the step. She still walked to the curb some mornings, dressed as sharply as ever, but her gait had changed. Stiffer, less certain. There was no more eye contact. No more side comments about Lena's natural aesthetic or whispered pleasantries offered from behind a curtain of judgment. Just silence. An uneasy silence, but a silence all the same. Lena resumed her routines, slowly at first. She didn't dismantle her security measures, didn't lower her vigilance, but she allowed herself to reclaim her evenings. She sat outside again, under the stars, with tea in hand and wind in the trees. Her garden, once a place marked by defiance, began to feel like home again. She replanted the tomato vine, not because she needed the fruit, but because she refused to let someone else decide what grew in her soil. The journalist followed up. The email was short, but the message was clear. It runs deeper than just a hose. You were right to keep records, you weren't the only one. He didn't elaborate, not yet, but the implication was enough. Karen's story wasn't unique. Her influence had seeped into more than one property line, more than one household. And while Lena had no interest in being the face of a public exposé, she understood now that her refusal to back down had shaken loose a truth that might otherwise have stayed buried. That mattered. It didn't heal the nerves, didn't erase the paranoia, but it gave weight to what she'd endured. She hadn't overreacted. She had survived something real. The police made one final visit. Quiet, procedural, a detective this time instead of a patrol officer. He asked her for access to the files again. Asked if she'd be willing to sign a statement if needed. Lena agreed. She didn't ask what they'd found. She didn't need to. The man nodded when he left and said simply, "We've got enough. It's being handled." And that, oddly, was the hardest moment of all, because it was over. Not officially. Not with charges or confessions or apologies. But over in the way that pain sometimes just stops echoing. There was no celebration, no moment of clarity or victory, just space. Quiet, reclaimed space. Lena spent the following weekend cleaning. Not to erase what had happened, but to own it. She sorted her folders, refiled the documents, labeled and boxed the hard drives. She placed them in a cabinet, not hidden, not locked away in fear, but stored with purpose. Then she scrubbed the paint dye trap, removed it, disassembled it piece by piece, rinsed it clean, and packed it into a container marked Defense, Retired. She bought herself a new hose, bright red, thicker than the last one. Symbolic, perhaps, but also practical. On Sunday morning, she stood on her porch sipping coffee, watching a new family move into the house 3 doors down. Young couple. No kids. Tentative waves exchanged. Lena offered one back. Not eager, not cold. Just present.